All right, well, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. My name is David Godwin and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. From our Southern Fire Exchange team, I'm joined today by Marinelle Armstrong with Tall Timbers Research Station and Elliot Nowert with North Carolina State University. Our webinar today is jointly hosted with the SERPPAS Prescribed Fire Working Group and the SERPPAS At-Risk, Threatened, and Endangered Species Working Group. Today, we'll be learning about the intersection of fire management programs and bats in the Southeastern U.S. from a panel of experts who work in the field. Following the presentations, there'll be time for you to submit questions for further discussion, so I hope you'll hang on. It's now my pleasure to hand things over to Becky Harrison. Becky is the At-Risk Species Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Southeast region, and she's going to carry things forward. Welcome, Becky.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for having us today. We appreciate the opportunity to share a little information about bats with this community, but also introduce everybody to the SERPPAS network. And SERPPAS stands for Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability. SERPPAS is a voluntary collaboration comprised of state agencies in the South, including North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. We're also joined by regional leaders from various federal agencies and leaders from the Department of Defense and military services in the Southeast. SERPPAS was formed almost 20 years ago already, and it's been a really unique partnership that focuses on strategic planning with to promote collaborative decision-making really between public and private partners to both support military mission, conserve key habitats and species, sustain rural communities and industry, and most importantly, foster better coordination among partners in the region. And we really do appreciate the opportunity today to do that here. SERPPAS is really represented by 5 different working groups, 2 of which are here today, the Prescribed Fire Group and the At-Risk, Threatened and Endangered group that David mentioned. So I wanted to introduce the co-leads for that. I know that you're familiar with Jen and Elliot as they are active in this community, but if they could just pop on and wave real quickly, thank you. The Prescribed Fire Work Group is comprised of more than 60 wildland fire land managers, researchers, and practitioners from around the region. By promoting prescribed fire as a land management tool, this working group really focuses on minimizing the risk of catastrophic wildfires while restoring critical habitat and species needs in the Southeast. The working group meets monthly to discuss prescribed fire related challenges and opportunities, and anybody is welcome to join. So at the end of this intro, I will put some contact information for each of us. And if you're interested in joining either of the working group calls or learning more about the other working groups, I encourage everyone to reach out. The at-risk species the at-risk and threatened and endangered species working group collaborates with SERPPAS partners to develop and promote innovative strategies for conservation for both at-risk. And what I mean by at-risk is they're not quite listed for legal protections under the Endangered Species Act, but we work with this sort of pre-listing phase as well as listed species to increase flexibility for addressing impacts to both military mission and natural resource conservation concerns. We engage approaches that include conservation agreements, mitigation crediting strategies, and projects to increase status information for assessments that we're doing that we're considering for listing for a variety of at-risk species. And we meet every other month. Our next meeting is actually next week on October 4th, and we'll put some call-in information in the chat below. I am a co-lead for this group, and Lucas Cooksey. Lucas, can you pop on and wave? Thank you. Lucas is project director at the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute. Lucas is actually going to come back on after our main presentation and present some updates from Department of Defense's strategies for bat management as well. So as I mentioned, I'm with Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm a regional office employee, and I'm based in North Carolina. And it's my pleasure to introduce our main speaker today, Pete Pattavina. Pete is a biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and also supports the Southeast region. And we cover 10 states and the Caribbean, so the whole southern region of your group and a couple beyond. On a variety, so Pete's supporting a variety of conservation issues and serves as our white nose syndrome regional coordinator as well. So as Pete gets set up for his presentation, I'm going to go ahead and add some information in the chat just that you can follow up later. And when Pete and Lucas are done sharing information, I'll monitor the questions in the chat. So if you have a pressing question, please go ahead and type it in the chat, and I'll be taking a look at those and addressing them as we have time. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Pete. Pete, thanks so much for being available today.
Oh, thank you, Becky. How is everything showing up okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me today. I wouldn't say that fire is my forte, but I think I was, as Becky said, available. So I'll do the best that I can. So I am White Nose Syndrome Coordinator in the Southeast, as Becky mentioned, and I also am co-PI of our Southeastern North American Bat Monitoring Program, Bat Hub, which is newly formed and located at Clemson. I've described some of the functions of our Southeast Bat Hub that the Fish and Wildlife Service is currently funding, and how they can assist with all types of bat monitoring, and especially for bat monitoring and responses of bats to habitat management and fire. So I wanted to kind of go over what the general theme of this the presentation was, and I really want to hit home that sustainable forestry management for prescribed fire is good bat habitat management. But just like how we manage for all sorts of wildlife, we're going to have short-term gains. We're going to have different habitats that are coming in and out of optimization for different types of species. And that's no different than how we think about fire affecting quail habitat, turkey or deer habitat. And it's the same with bats. We'll also go over some of the variables that might determine specific effects or responses that bats have towards fire management. And along with fire management, we also have fuel reductions. We have harvest all mixed in there. So it can be pretty complex when we start talking about bats' response to fire and forestry practices. And then, of course, we'll go over the requisite, like how bats are important. We all love bats. Yay, you know. And then we'll go over some of the species of concern, what we have in the pipeline coming up for listings, why they're listed, and then we'll go over some bat history traits that may also help calibrate how you think about bats' response to fire on both the community level and on an individual level. So bats are important drivers of ecosystems. They're apex predators. There's also a lot of misconceptions about bats. Bats are generally thought of parallel to rodents. They are not like rodents. They are very slow reproducing. They're very long-lived. We've had little brown myotis at 38 or 40 years old. They are you have highly structured communities and communication. They have fidelity towards their natal areas. They migrate. They also have really strange physiologies that allow them to fly. So basically, they have this really crazy anti-inflammatory response, which keeps many viruses at sublethal levels for bats, which is why they tend to be reservoirs for new and emerging viruses and things like rabies. They also are important to our economy. Just for the corn industry alone, they generally save farmers about $3 an acre of higher yield. And what they did is they looked at excluding bats from farm fields with big exclosures during the evenings, and then looked at damage to actual corn kernels, and determined that bats have this incredible influence over our nation's food supply. In the Southeast, we have 19 species, and I've highlighted here bats that are of concern. These are the ones that are going to eat our lunch when we talk about any type of regulatory constraints that we might have. You see a little Tiderata, Mexican free-tailed bat here on the right. We have tricolor bat, which is tricolor bat, and our little brown, our northern long-eared bat are species of greatest concern in terms of it being over really broad areas at very low densities, it's really difficult to plan for because they have small colonies. They might have nondescript habitat. They may switch roosts. Some of their habitat choices aren't always evident right there on the landscape. But we also have Florida bonneted bat, which has an incredibly limited range. That also brings up some questions on how you manage for bats, depending on how they roost and how big the colonies are. And then it should be, I should mention that all these bats are have different types of jaws and different wing shapes that optimize the foraging yield, that optimize how they forage and what they feed on. So for instance, gray myotis like to forage over streams, so they tend to feed on aquatic insects like mayflies and stoneflies, whereas big brown bats have really strong, powerful jaws. They're optimized to eat coleoptera or beetles. So all of these bats are much like you would find fish in a lake, except instead of a lake, they are spread out among the air column at night. And then in the daytime, they have their little ecological niches as well, with different choices in habitat for foraging and for roosting. You can see that many of these bat species, tricolored bat and gray myotis, little brown myotis, Indiana myotis, and northern long-eared myotis are all affected severely by white nose syndrome. That disease now affects 13 species in North America. And then the bats are also hit really hard by wind turbines. And so we have hoary bats, which we know very little about in the Southeast or anywhere, that are in our listing work plan for 2027. And we also have little brown myotis under review. That's an incredibly wide-ranging species. And so we're really trying to get a handle on what their population levels look like in the Western US before we make a decision. What complicates how we think about bats is how they use different habitats at different points in their life history. So starting off in the summer, they form maternity colonies. Those maternity colonies can be all different sizes. They can number in the tens or hundreds of thousands, like species like Southeastern myotis, or they could be solitary roosters like red bats, eastern red bats, or form really small colonies like tricolored bats. And the way that they form maternity colonies can also dictate how you plan around temporary, short-term disturbances like prescribed fire. Often bats will then migrate to another area where they aggregate in higher densities on the landscape around, say, caves. This is especially true for myoted bats and tricolored bats. They breed, they have a delayed fertilization, so they enter hibernation where it suspends the development of their embryo and milk production and fertilization. They then emerge from hibernation into spring staging habitat, which is generally located around the hibernacula. Again, they're in higher densities there, so that's a consideration when you are doing any kind of disturbance, that type of habitat. And then they migrate to sometimes hundreds, if it's a hoary bat, it might be thousands of miles to their summer habitat. Why they pass over seemingly optimal habitat for them to roost in an area that's in someone's backyard is beyond anyone's understanding, but they do have a high fidelity towards their natal areas. And then the process starts all over again. I think when we talk about habitat manipulation or habitat enhancements, the conversation always leads to the response on the individual level. And I think we really need to calibrate how we discuss habitat management and what the risks are of not managing habitat. If you could see this photograph on the right, this overstocked mess of what I assume to be loblolly pine, no bat can effectively forage in that. In fact, what can even bias some sampling is that that's often where we catch a high number of bats when we set up nets in corridors that go through really highly stocked pine forests. Those bats are utilizing those narrow corridors for commuting, and it can often artificially inflate the importance of those forests to our bat community. You can imagine how difficult it would be to try to capture a bat on this beautiful pine flatwoods here on the right. But I think that's how we need to discuss how we look at responses to fire and responses to forest reactions, and try to keep it at a community level. And in your discussions, when you have to get regulatory approval for that, I think it's good to kind of keep on both sides, keep a balanced view of that. Looking at this picture at the right, I'm reminded of the first time I set foot over 20 years ago into a really well-managed longleaf pine forest. And the state botanist told me that old growth was under my feet as well as over my head. And I think that's really important for us to keep sight of, is that, trying to get that herbaceous community into a condition where we have high diversity, production of lots of food for bats and birds and all sorts of other species is really our end goal. And how do we navigate some of these legal constraints on top of all the other constraints of trying to affect burns with crew and humidity and temperature and smoke management plans? How do we navigate these little constraints in order to maximize the amount of habitat that we're treating? And there is no silver bullet, unfortunately, because the responses of fire can be so highly variable, depending on what species we're thinking about and the dynamics of fire, some of which are not predictable. So we have bats that are migratory, so they're some parts of the year and some parts of the year they're not there. We have different densities, on the landscape, depending if you're in swarming or staging habitat. You have maternity areas where you might have large or small colonies. You have hibernation areas where you might not want to smoke in a cave. Sometimes bat habitat and landscape is cryptic, or roosts are. Sometimes you can't plan around that type of habitat. You can't effectively plan around preserving 2-inch stems that with a knot hole that a northern long-eared myotis might use. Where bats choose to roost, depending on how high they are from flames and how they might be insulated from carbon monoxide exposure, heat exposure, smoke. When we have non-volency periods, maybe bats can't flee the fire because we've got non-volant young. And although bats can carry a pup, I would think it would be difficult for a red bat to carry 2 or 3 pups, or the same for a tricolored bat. All this, of course, is affected by fire intensity, the frequency of the fire, how big a fire is, the diversity after a fire that you expect, depending on the productivity and long-term benefits, the seasonality of that fire. Whether you have a head fire versus a backing fire, head fires might not give bats enough time to flee the advancing flames, but we do know that they do have cues in order to try to avoid flames. And many of you have probably experienced Seminole bats or red bats roosting in leaf litter and then flying off in advance of some of the fire line. We also have ambient temperatures at time of ignition, which dictate how bats might respond on the individual level, that is. And then afterwards, it's really difficult to understand how the plant and invertebrate community that occurs after a fire is going to be beneficial to bats. But I don't think it's any mystery to look at those 2 pictures that I showed of a really overly stocked mass with high basal area versus the pine flatwoods, that it doesn't take rocket science to understand that you've got a much better habitat that is well structured in a mosaic over the landscape that can benefit lots of species of bats. When we think about community response to bats, I think it's good to kind of think about it in maybe its most basic way. So if you look at wing aspect ratios for bats, the wing on the left is kind of short and stubby, and it has a low aspect ratio. Well, that's a wing that is adapted for clutter. That's going to be a wing that you'd find on tricolored bats, on many of the myoted bats, on big-eared bats like Cornorhinus. They're going to be in your hardwood drains and your dense forests, maybe in small streams that go through woodlands that are less conducive to carrying fire. Versus the wing on the right, this is a wing that you would see on, say, a free-tailed bat or a hoary bat. Longer, narrower, it can't maneuver as well. A wing like that on a Pattavina have been clocked, I think, at about 110 miles an hour at like 3,000 meters. So, these bats are foraging oftentimes above the canopy or in really open forests. And so they have feeding gills that are dictated by their wings. As you start to change habitat, as illustrated in this figure from Becky. As you start to open habitat, you're going to be selecting and optimizing foraging for these bats with these higher wing aspect ratios. And so that's why we have species like Florida bonneted bat really selecting these open pine flatwoods, probably what basal area of 20, I guess. You can see that slash pine snag on the left. The bats are up in a crack in the top of that, but this is where you have management for red cockaded woodpecker that is really conducive and beneficial to Florida bonneted bats. And these are the few natural roosts that we find for bonneted bats where they're utilizing RCW cavities, sometimes ones that are abandoned or enlarged, but also, you know, fire is providing great foraging habitat and maybe creating sags that they can use as well. This is also illustrative of some of the really particular BMPs that might need to be incorporated when you have a species as rare as a bonneted bat, where every single roost is important because the species is always on the verge of imperilment or jeopardy. So every colony of that species is important, but you don't have to have all these considerations if you have a bat that may roost in small numbers or maybe spread across the landscape, or it has the capacity and redundancy in its own abundance that it can take short-term effects. And so I really want to hit that point, is that I didn't want this presentation to be a list of BMPs, because BMPs tend to be used as a checklist that everyone has to follow. And some of those BMPs may not be practicable for practitioners that are trying to incorporate fire into natural systems. But some of these things you can see would be really trying your hardest to retain all these roosts, and then maintaining any future roosts, like trying to keep snags standing if possible, and then doing some fuel reductions around these roosts within 300 feet, but times a year when it would be less disruptive to maternity colonies for bonneted bats. So that's an example of how we might have a gold standard of managed for every single roost. If you start looking at other community response to the fire, generally literature is favorable, and prescribed fire always wins over wildfire because of the intensity of wildfires and their propensity to knock out the canopy in so many cases, and how long it takes for habitat to rebound afterwards. But Indiana myotis in different areas tend to prefer forest that's burned. In the Shoal Creek Ranger District in Alabama, they found that Indiana myotis liked forests that had a higher return, or I guess a more frequent fire return interval, looking at forests that had fire interval between 0 and 5.5 years versus northern long-eared bats that are more plastic in how they select roosts and in habitat that's more cluttered. And so that hits home the message that mosaics on the landscape, which are always a result of prescribed fire and good forest management, are great for whole guilds of species. And then in the Central Appalachians, that holds true, but to a lesser extent. It's really difficult to get to looking at research on specific responses to fire, because oftentimes bats don't really change depending on how, they can migrate through areas and commute through areas. So oftentimes their behavior may not change, or we can't measure that change as easily. And there's not a ton of studies on fire and response to bats. Susan Loeb's most recent review of fire and bat from 2021 looks at about 50, maybe 55 studies globally that look at different aspects of bats' response to fire. As I said, the last slide there's a couple of review articles that you can jot down that can kind of springboard you into as deep of a hole you want to get into in terms of your own research. We also have some of these less tangible aspects of fire. So we know that fires return things like phosphorus to aquatic systems that will have an effect on the invertebrate community, but that's highly variable as well. And then when we think about species, even in wetlands, fire going across hardwood bottoms may cause fire scarring in hollow bowls, which are great habitats for Southeastern myotis and the Coriolanus genus big-eared bats. And it's also been shown that when you rip fire through areas that haven't had fire before, and you've got species fire intolerant species such as beech and maple that come in, that it can kill those. It can kill those trees and then create snags that are then colonized by Indiana myotis. So even when you have fire intervals that are longer, we can still see responses in the bat community. As mentioned before, we all know that wildfires are less preferable to prescribed fires, so reducing fuel loads allows habitat to come back into a condition that we want it to see in. It creates those mosaics across the landscape, and we keep our forest canopy intact. Also, responses to wildfire cause lots of soil disturbance. Soil disturbance brings in invasive species. You might need to use, chemical control of wildfires. So there's lots of reasons why we should need to keep our habitat in good shape, and that is not lost on this group. But we should also consider too that even though there might be individual responses of bats to fire, a bat that is optimized to live in the Southeast should have some evolutionary capability to deal with fire, and we do see that. So Dickinson found that when fires were ignited about 20 meters from northern long-eared bat roosts, that those bats did rouse in about 10 minutes. That's about 88 degrees, so it's in the height of summer, so those bats probably weren't torpid. And then they flew in a little ways to an unburned area, and then would rouse occasionally. So yeah, you could potentially expose that bat to higher predation because it's off its roost, but again, there's not many studies that look at how those perturbations really affect in a significant way, or whether they're take of bats. Bats will rouse from torpor in about 20 minutes. It's probably a minimum, but then there's also some research that shows that they may not be as receptive to smoke and sound cues from fire. At about 5 degrees Celsius, bats may take 30 to 60 minutes to rouse, but I think many of those studies are in need. Those are very general studies, and you may have even more specific information for that you've experienced in your own burns. You could also have a loss of roosts from fire, or you can expose bats that are in crevices or cavities in a differential way. Cavities may be more insulated from smoke and fire and heat if a fire goes through very quickly. Crevices may trap carbon monoxide and smoke. Leaf clusters, if they're high in a tree, it may not affect those bats at all. Also, as you burn around caves, generally, if you're clearing or opening up forest canopy, it could potentially have an effect on the internal temperature and humidity of those caves. I will say that we don't have any solid research that shows that prescribed fire has ever affected a cave roost. We have instances of vandalism where people burn tires and set fires in caves and roused an entire colony of bats, but it is a concern, and some agencies like the Forest Service will list a cave as a smoke target in their burn management plans. And some caves, like grayback caves, have what's called reverse chimneying. So they have an entrance way up on top and an entrance on bottom. And in the summertime, that cold, dense air flows out. You sometimes even need a jacket when you stand next to those caves when you're looking at bats emerge. And so smoke could potentially come into that cave from the top and then form in eddies into some of the domes where they like to have maternity colonies. I guess there could be a response, but again, that's just theory. Roost height and type matters when you're thinking about effects of fire to bats on the individual level. So bats that might be 12 to 15 meters, and foliage roosting bats sometimes do roost very high, or you saw that roost earlier from South Carolina, that northern myotis and the yellow pine, roosting very high. Modeling suggests that those bats may not see any appreciable effect from fire. However, some male bats will often roost really low. So again, highly variable. And then, depending on the time of year, you may have flightless pups on a roost that could experience differential effects from fire, depending on how high they are. And then policy and regulations. So for military people on the call, the new listings would trigger modifications of in-ramps at military installations. And I would suggest that, for in-ramps, you design monitoring, really look at general effects or general effects to bats in a way that makes sense for your management. So if you had, bonneted bats or Indiana bats that are clustering in really large numbers or forming really large maternity colonies, that might be where you might need specific data. If you're just talking about low densities of tricolored bats or northern long-eared bats, maybe acoustics can work for you, and they can be put in different habitats or different forest compartments that are going to be managed, and you can get some fine scale data on what you actually have in terms of like indices of activity of bats at different times of year. Because in the subtropical forests of the Southeast, we do have what looks like almost year-round activity of both northern long-eared myotis and tricolored bats, and they are typically roosting in the winter in non-traditional places like in trees, in culverts, and wetlands, sometimes up in pines and clusters of leaves for tricolored bats when there's not a lot of structure when leaves fall in autumn, so they might move to pines. And then when you think about approaching, say, your field office with effects, are there actions that you can pull out of your burn? Like, if you can't manage certain BMPs because you really need to burn when you need to burn, can you, say, take thinning operations and move them to non-volant season, into periods where that there are no non-volant pups on the roost, where you're not going to crush or injure young flightless bats. Instead of taking just kind of cookie cutter best management practices, which ones are really reasonable? Which ones are still going to allow you to get to your desired future conditions for your management? And is take reasonably certain to occur. If you say, hey, I'm in South Carolina, I'm in North Carolina, what should I do on my burn plan? What should I do in my forestry operation to avoid bats? They're going to tell you, well, don't clear and don't burn during non-volancy periods. Well, that might not be something that you can do. It might not be practicable. So really come to the table knowing what you have on site, knowing what your resources are. Talk to your local bat biologists and your heritage folks, so that when you come with a plan, how that field, make it easy for the field office to have a conversation about what your effects are and keep those effects lean. If you really want to manage your strategic plan 100,000 acres, but really you're only going to manage 2,000, don't come to us saying, hey, we want take statement on 100,000 acres. Well, it's really difficult if everyone comes to the table wanting to take statements for everything under the sun. Section 7 is not an insurance policy for you. It is really an honest and true estimation of effects. If we keep those consultations lean, it means that there's enough take in many of these bat populations that we can all perform our actions without fear of litigation. Non-federal actions for you, for those of you that are with NGOs, it's very difficult. We do have Section 10, which are habitat conservation plans, but they're often very clunky, especially if you don't have a lot of land to manage. We're looking at ways that we can work under the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Act with agreements between landowners to have positive effects on bats in exchange for take statements. We're still working on that. It's kind of new, but we're working with the forest industry with some aspects of that. But again, do your homework on your sites. Is it really reasonably certain that you're going to have take on those sites? To my knowledge, we've never had a Section 9 violation, meaning a take violation of the ESA that's occurred because of a forestry action. So understand your level of risk. Do you really have bats on site? Is your burn maybe going to be high intensity where you have the potential to really injure or kill bats? Do you have caves on your site that you really need to make concessions for? Do whatever you can before you approach your field office so that they understand the resources that you have and how your burn plans may affect threatened and endangered species. Luckily, for those of you that just have probably low densities of bats like tricolored bat and northern long-eared bats. Acoustics might be a great low-cost tool for you to utilize to look at activity in different areas. Now, you're not going to get perhaps a number of bats that you're going to affect, but you can get an idea of when bats are using those landscapes around you, and you can make decisions based on that. And it doesn't mean that your management has to change. It means that when you approach your field office, you can give them a realistic estimate of effects that are going to occur for the amount of habitat that you want to manage or thin and burn. And don't fall into the trap of collecting so much data that doesn't help your decision-making process. Do you really need roost data for tricolored bats that use clusters of leaves when that cluster of leaves will be gone next year? Or do you need roost-specific data on northern long-eared bats? You might. I mean, you might decide that that is the way that you want to go because you might have nearby records, or maybe you really want to use a rifle approach instead of a shotgun approach to how you manage, depending on what you're managing for. But design your monitoring so it makes sense, so that you can do it in the most cost-effective way, so that you can continue to enhance habitat. I always encourage people to utilize the North American Bat Monitoring Program database. We've had this around, I'm thinking, almost 10 years now, but it's really becoming a powerful tool. It can accept all types of data, from capture records, acoustic surveys, both mobile acoustic routes and stationary routes, and summer and winter colony counts, both on your lands and off your lands. So you can make data requests of other partners in the portal and run GIS analyses on what you have in terms of your risk. You can also layer a lot of this data over your specific forest information, your FIA data, for instance. All that data is managed and housed at USGS. We're always looking for partners to contribute to it, because it feeds into our status and trends analyses continent-wide. And like I said, you can often use a lot of the spatial products that will be coming out of the database, or you can customize yourself, because all your files are stored in a preserved condition. You can always download all of those flat files, all those Excel files with all the specifics, and use them for any purpose. And it's archived. And so you don't have to worry about not finding the specific file from the biologist that predated you. This should live forever. There also are some standard data visualization products, like this histogram on the right that shows tricolor bat calls. I think this is actually statewide, but it could be for cells that you want to monitor. And so there's lots of canned products in there. I won't say that it's an easy database to start using and start adding data to. But we do have assistance with that in the Southeast. Our newly fledged Southeastern Bat Hub, Ben Neese, is our hub coordinator, and he's really great at helping partners understand if any bat is right for them, and helping to design monitoring programs. We actually have a couple pilot projects that we're starting with Camp Lejeune and Fort Stewart. They have year-round activity of both tricolored bats and northern long-eared bats. And so we designed a monitoring program for them that would look at indices of activity throughout their military installations, so that when they are managing large swaths of land by compartment for red cockaded woodpecker management or recovery, I should say, we can get an estimate of how those habitats are also used by bats. This Bat Hub is co-managed by myself, by David Joukowsky out of Clemson, and then Susan Lobo of the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station. We also have lots of tools, like we have licenses for acoustic software here. So you can grab a kaleidoscope license. We have a small amount of equipment that you can rent if you want to try, not rent, you can borrow. Sorry, you can borrow if you want to try out some acoustic monitoring. We also do some manual vetting of calls so that we can sort of fine tune what you have for bat community at your particular site. There's also scripts that can be helpful for converting old old legacy data. We just put in 80,000 records from Arnold Air Force Base of bat data that was stretched back, I think 20 or 30 years. And we got all that into the database. And again, all that feeds into status and trends models for these species so that we can make good decisions on these species as a whole. That also helps with individual actions because it means that if we have representation, good representation of data across the distribution range of these bats, we can prove that we're not at jeopardy for them. And these bats can take short-term hits to individuals or to their community and still persist in a healthy manner over time. I mentioned a few articles. These 3 articles can really springboard you into a lot of the available research. This Perry article up top is a great review of fire and has lots of case studies, particularly with myotis. And so for further reading, please visit those. They're easy to Google too, so you don't really need that slide, but hey, here it is. It's part of the service. So I hope this was helpful. I wish there was a silver bullet that could tell you exactly what you need to do at your site, but that really doesn't exist. But I'm hoping that when it'll give you at least the tools that you can take charge of your own management and really be able to steer your consultations in a direction where it makes sense. So thank you very much. And I think that concludes everything for me.
Thank you, Pete. That was fantastic. So I encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A so we can circle back to it. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and pivot to Lucas. Lucas is going to share some information about some of the ongoing strategies that Department of Defense is using for bat management on the ground. Lucas.
Great job, Pete, and thank you, Becky. Appreciate that. Don't have any slides today, but just want to provide some general updates. The DoD may not have a silver bullet, but they're trying to work on one. I guess long story short, we here at Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute support Office of Secretary of Defense Natural Resource Program with consultation, policy, support, deep dive type projects, but ERDIC, Environmental Research and Engineering Research and Development Center of Army Corps of Engineers has been funded to come up with a Section 7 solution for the four bat species, Indiana bat, northern long-eared, tricolor, and little brown. And so in support of their development of that consultation and in our support of Office of Secretary of Defense, DoD sent out a tasker to all the military services that did 2 things, and this was in the fall of 2022. One, we had a survey, 1, 2, 3 kind of survey that went out to all of the military services and natural resource practitioners across the continental U.S. within the range of one of the 4 bat species, looking for things just as have they done presence or absence surveys? Do they have known hibernacula? Do they have their own site-specific consultation? Things of that nature. And then along with that, as part of the response to that, is they had to send in their integrated natural resource management plans. So there's now the first of its kind of a library of all of the NREPs, which may sound somewhat surprising, but different military services had different amounts or extents of their NREPs, but now we have a full inventory, and we're working to transfer those to DNICS to where they're available to everybody. My team then went and did a deep dive of all of those NREPs of all the bat species within those ranges to look at what are the current best management practices, what are they doing, forest management, pesticide, herbicide, prescribed burning, you name it. So really to try and get a solid foundational data informed base to start working towards that consultation on. So one, user input data about presence, absence, existing consultations, and nuances that affect bats. But 2, what are in those planning documents already? What are the time of year windows? What are the considerations? What are the monitoring protocols? And as you would expect, it spans a pretty solid gamut. The ones that have had Indiana bats have been more long-term monitoring, or the long-eared bats next, and then others was interesting to see how that trickled out further west as other surveys and management is starting to get there with these listing decisions. So I say that, and the reason I don't have any slides is all of this is still draft material and draft information being summarized and utilized by ERDIC to coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they've been working with Fish and Wildlife Service, and the goal is to develop a single Section 7 consultation that will support all of the military services, their land management activities, their NREP updates for all 4 of the bat species. They started with an informal consultation with the previously pending or impending listing decision, Northern Long-eared bat. But since that listing decision or the effective date was pushed out a year, that's now given that time to utilize more of this data to look at that specifically. And so no more to follow. I mean, it's Eric Britsky at ERDIC and Dave McNaughton. And again, I can provide their contact information. You can reach out to me if you're part of the military services, but the headquarters of each military service has all of that data, and it would be available to each military service or military installation if they wanted to look into that, again, since it's DoD draft data. But I guess long story short, that's kind of where we're at, you know. And I know that's pretty broad overview, but I think that's really kind of getting at a lot of the different things Pete had talked about, is how the DoD is really trying to get at an understanding of what the footprint, what the current conservation footprint looks like with a data informed with an informed data set, a very current data set, and then be able to coordinate with Fish and Wildlife Service to really come up with what are the meaningful best management practices, what are the appropriate best management practices, what are the avoidance and minimization measures that make sense, and then also in areas that, you know, given the military mission, that's just going to elicit take. And as that does, how do we calculate that collectively, you know, across the military services, so we don't end up with each military installation having to do their own consultation, each field office. So it's really a huge force multiplier for both agencies to build that consistency, have a common ground for implementation, management, and monitoring of those 4 species. So really expect more to see more of that to come out in the next year or so. But with that, I'll turn it over to Becky and go back to
Great.
questions.
Thanks, Lucas. And just for folks' clarity, the species that Lucas mentioned that the team is working on the BMPs for, that's both things we're considering for listing and already protected species. So it's a nice blend of sort of the regulatory requirements and the sort of creative solutions for on-the-ground management for both of those groups, which I think is great. So kudos to you and the team, Lucas, for creating that document. We did have a question in the chat about sharing it. It's not quite ready for prime time, but it looks like, Lucas, do you think the time frame is maybe the next year?
I hope so. A lot of it was just data summaries, you know, so it wasn't actual report formats. So a lot of it was just data summaries by region or by topic area. You know, here's a summary of pesticide information found in NREPs directly related to bats. Something of that nature. Here's a forest management practice directly related to bats to really kind of get that cross section of things. There was a presentation at NIMFWA that, I mean, we could probably release that last year. You could find on the National Military Fish and Wildlife Association's archives from last year, and it was really more about the process by which the data was gathered, but really that summary data, you know, is still being utilized on those. And again, there's nothing controversial or aha or amazing. I mean, it really is just tabular data at this point that's utilized for reference and pulse check.
Great. Thanks, Lucas. I'm going to go ahead and take a look. Pete, I already see that you're in the Q&A, and thank you for starting that. I'm gonna just revisit a couple of questions and link some things to the general chat as well. So the first question was about the reports of white nose syndrome in the Western and Central states. Pete shared an interactive map through whitenosesyndrome.org, but did you want to speak anything else to that, Pete? I'll put that link in the chat too.
Yeah, I thought I put a link to our map. So we do have an interactive map on whitenosesyndrome.org that's maintained by USGS. And then oftentimes individual states will put on their own, like individual state wildlife agencies will put their year-end reports on white nose syndrome effects also on their websites. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Our map is just what we have for surveillance results. I wouldn't say it's a written report, but there are some formal reports that come out. And then many states also have white nose response plans, local white nose response plans as well.
Awesome, thanks, Pete. There was a question about implementing species banking for different bat species. Are you aware of any range-wide system in development, or is it mostly local?
What I've seen is mostly local, and it's for really particular effects. Generally, it's been the Federal Highway Administration that's been leading that mitigation effort. Mitigation, we have an approved mitigation policy with the service. It's really tricky to implement. It has to be done on a voluntary basis, and there's a lot of emotion around banking, and so many contingencies in place, it becomes quite expensive. But
thank you.
I'm only aware of some of the in lieu fee agreements that have been in place for highway projects. And there's been a few standalone mitigation plans put together for energy pipelines, like oil and gas pipelines, natural gas pipelines.
Okay, great. There were a couple of questions about if there were recommended snag density per acre, or
it's
preferred species to sort of preserve, and I'm guessing that's going to be bat species specific, but could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's been a real long time since I looked at snag density. I want to say the recommendation was like a minimum of like 8 snags per acre. And I think that's a really general metric. In terms of preferred tree snag species, I mean, for decades, we've looked at preferences of endangered bats to different tree species, but a lot of that work was done in the Midwest. In the Southeast, you know, they don't have a lot of pines. What they have are white pines, right? Or and they have really thin bark. And so our southern yellow pines have really thick bark, and so the snags stay around a lot longer. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a species that is that we should think about. It's really the structure, and so our yellow pine snags create great structure when bark starts flaking off for our myoted bats, and it stays around for a long time. So thin bark species like maples and beech may be suitable for a year or two. So maybe you might want to consider that a less preferable snag. So those thick bark species that stick around for quite a while are going to make great roosts for bats.
Great, thanks, Pete. And I would add to that, you know, bats in the Southeast, especially along coastal plain areas, are behaving a little differently than we're seeing them in inland. So they're using a larger diversity of tree species, and they're, you know, not necessarily migrating in the way that we would predict them to in other areas. So I think that is a good reminder to sort of consult with your local experts in state and heritage programs, and talk to, you know, reach out to Pete or me or folks in Fish and Wildlife Service, ecological services offices in the states for more technical guidance as well. There was a question about, is the establishment of artificial roosts or bat boxes beneficial in managing bat density?
It's been very effective. So at Fort Knox in Kentucky, they've put up Brandon bark, and in other areas too. Brandon bark is basically a telephone pole that has like a latex or some sort of polymer that simulates pine bark at the density, pardon me, the Indiana bats like to use. And they've been some of our biggest roosts. So it's very effective for creating artificial snags. Rocket boxes are also really effective for lots of myoted bats and others like free-tailed bats and big brown bats and evening bats. So it tends to be both. What I've seen, both rocket boxes and Brandon bark are great tools that one could use to create snag habitat in areas where snags may be limited.
Thanks, Pete. I think our last open question is referring to ongoing research about the effects of white nose, the combined effects of white nose and prescribed fire. Did Susan address this in her most recent compilation?
No, I don't think there is any research that would link the two. And there's probably good reason for that. One is that we generally tend to do our surveillance in caves and we don't always know where those bats go in the summer. But very quickly, so PD or Pseudogymnoascus destructans is a pathogen that causes white nose syndrome. It's a psychrophilic fungus, so it really prefers cold temperatures, and bats very quickly shed all traces of PD very soon after they leave the hibernaculum. So by the time bats get to their summer habitat, it would be very difficult to know whether that bat actually exposed PD that prior winter. So no, not that I'm aware of, and I think functionally it'd be very difficult to link the two together.
Thanks, Pete. I think that's all the questions in the chat. I appreciate everybody's high level of interest. This is such an engaging topic, and there's a lot more to come on this, as you've heard from both Pete and Lucas. I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. Thank you, David and Jen. And I'll turn it back over to David.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for your presentations today. We covered a lot of territory. Really appreciate it. Based on the audience we had, there's certainly a lot of interest in what you guys had to share with us. So we're right at the end of our time for today. Becky, Pete, Lucas, do you have any final comments that you would like, parting comments that you would like to share with everyone?
Just thanks for all the interest in the topic. I was quite surprised when I agreed to give the presentation that there were possibly 400 attendees.
Yeah. Thank you again to everyone. Thanks to Pete for presenting. And we'd love to have folks join the SERPPAS working group. So please let us know if you're interested in joining any of those calls, or otherwise, we're happy to help.
Thank you much, and lots more to follow. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, great. Well, thank you all. If you would like to follow up with our speakers today, we have their contact information there on the screen. They've got email addresses. So at the end, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, speakers. Enjoyed your presentations today. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Have a good afternoon.